Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn in our study of Dante's Inferno now to Canto number 2. We're going to think about this canto. Maybe we can name it as the Invocation of the Muse and the explanation why. So maybe you can put that in your notes as a little mini title. Now, hey, as I've said before, if you haven't been following our stuff, you need to go to learnstrong.net, find that AP folder. My assumption in this series of lectures is over each of the cantos of Inferno is that you have worked through everything we've done from especially the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. Hypercritically, you know the Aeneid to read Dante, as we've said. Everything up through and including our study of St. Augustine's Confessions. And as well, we've given an intro lecture to the Inferno and as well, of course, a lecture over Canto 1. Just to review Canto 1, we are on at 7th of April, 1300. Dante is 35 years old and he's lost in a wood of error. We have a leopard, a lion, and a wolf that will come to convince him that he can't go up the hill of the Lord. And then Virgil will show up and say, I'm here to save you. In the the second canto now, the obvious question will be, why are you here? Like, why did you show up? And technically, let's put this in our notes. Scholars have pointed out for a long time that because there's 100 cantos in the entire Divine Comedy, and each section or canticle has really technically the 33 cantos. The first canto, because there's 34 in Inferno, 34 cantos instead of 33, the first is kind of like an introduction to the entire Divine Comedy. So really, in Canto 2, we have the beginning of Inferno, so that's kind of significant for us. Now again, the hope is that you're reading this material on your own and then using me for help. Our learning theory, again, is to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, especially in our reading annotative theory, where we answer 3 guiding questions. What does the text say? Level 1, what does the text mean? Level 2, 2A, messages, themes. 2B, reminding you that we're concentrating on symbolism and irony. And we're focusing on Dante as particularly poet, politician, and philosopher. And then finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in meaningful ways? The reason why I'm doing a lecture over every canto instead of the way it's usually done, where you take several cantos and you kind of talk about them in a unit or whatever, is I really want to challenge you in each canto to try and find something that you can resonate with. At 3A, we'll continue to make our relationships to all the texts we've studied, especially the Iliad, the Odyssey, and especially the Aeneid, and then other texts as well that we've worked with. We're going to make a lot of references to Dante in our Dante study to St. Augustine for reasons that I think will become self-evident after our study of Confessions. And then finally at level 3B, we'll ask, how can I personally relate to this information? The reason why 3B is such an important question for us in the study of Dante. I mean, it's important in all study because it's a good mnemonic for us, right? It helps us to be able to remember texts better if we can relate it to ourselves personally. But think about this. In Dante we have, what we also have in Confessions of St. Augustine, a piece of autobiography, very much like Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, although, as we said in that lecture, he didn't write that for it to be read, and yet it's self-disclosure of a kind. And so we're going to point out the importance of the individual reading. It's clear that Dante, through the Divine Comedy, is working through the question of what it means to be in serious exile. Not just physical exile, but emotional exile, spiritual exile as well, right? Okay, let's do a quick now summary of Canto 2. First, we'll have the Invocation of the Muse by Dante to capture, of course, the similar kind of thing that happens in Homer and, of course, his hero Virgil in the Aeneid. Then we will have Dante the Pilgrim asking Virgil, why me? And he's going to make an interesting reference, allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N, a reference back to the Aeneid itself. And then Virgil will say, well, I'm here because I was sent. Beatrice came from heaven to tell me I needed to come and find you and guide you through first hell, then purgatory, and then, of course, as we read in the first canto, I'm gonna let you go. Dante will say at the end of Canto 2, all right, I'm committed to the cause, I'm restored. He says, I'm ready to do my thing. Let's go ahead now and just work through Canto 2, and let's make points as we go. The day has come to an end. Day was departing, and the darkening air called all earth's creatures to their evening quiet. Now, if this sounds at all familiar to you, go back to our lectures on Aeneid 3, 8, and 9. And in all three of those books of the Aeneid, at book 3, line 147, at book 8, lines 26, 27, at book 9, lines 224 to 226, you'll have a very similar kind of comment being made about how in the evening it's quiet and all the animals and everything, all of Earth's creatures are at rest. We're going to see, by the way, something very similar when we hit our Milton's Paradise Lost. So just put that in your notes. We're told, while I alone, that reminds us of the number of times that each one of our heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, or Ulysses, and of course Aeneas, are all defined as heroes alone. That's significant for Dante the Pilgrim, as Dante the writer is creating him, right? While I alone was preparing as though for war. Now, let's pause for a moment and put this in our notes. Yes, we're familiar with this term, some of you even smiling. That Aristeia that we talked about in both the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, the preparation for battle and all of that. In other words, we are having definitely the extension of the idea that Dante the Pilgrim is going to battle, going to war. But in the same way, and Dante was familiar with the way in which Socrates is kind of the new Odysseus, the new Achilles. Plato's Apology will make that very clear. Dante is playing a very similar game. He is going to war, but a different kind of war, right? A different kind of war. He says, while I alone was preparing as though for war, to struggle with my journey and with the spirit of pity, which flawless memory will redraw. O muses, O genius of art, O memory whose merit has inscribed inwardly those things I saw, help me fulfill the perfection of your nature. Now, the invocation of the muse here is very, very brief. And notice we don't begin by specifically addressing, as we do in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, the hero of the poem. But notice here, three different muses are referenced. The muse, of course, of poetry, the muse, the genius of art, and of course, of memory. Let's put it in our notes, though. This will be, I think, one of the important elements of why this poem continues to resonate. As we said at the very beginning of AP, when we began, we are the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. Of course, what's the point of a story? I mean, think about that. We've been saying this now for a while. What's the point of a story? Because we have a tendency to forget. The only sin is to forget, is maybe a reading of Dante's Inferno. In other words, we sin, for Dante, when we forget what matters, or we lose the power of intellect, will be the way he says it. In other words, he calls on memory. He says, I hope I can tell this well enough, because I went through this experience, and I hope that I can remember it well enough so that I can share it with others. Right? Notice here he says, help me fulfill the perfection of your nature. I commenced. Now this will be Dante the Pilgrim. Poet, take my measure now. Apprise my powers before you trust me to venture through the deep passage where you would be my guide. You write of the journey Silvius's father, Aeneas obviously, made to immortal realms, though he stayed a mortal witness in his corruptible body. In other words, we're familiar in Book 6 of the Aeneid how it is the case that Aeneas makes his journey into the underworld. That the opponent of all evil bestowed such favor on him befits him, chosen for glory by highest heaven to be the father of Rome and of Rome's empire, later established holy seat of great Peter's heir. In other words, note Dante, he does a very interesting quick two-step here with readers of his poem. He says, in the same way that you know the Aeneid is the story of how Aeneas becomes the founder of the greatest peoples in the history of the world, the Roman people. Remember, Dante is Italian after all. In the same way that Aeneas set up all of that project, he really set up the project of course, St. Peter and the Catholic Church. In other words, there is a religious reading. We stay kind of away from this so that we could say it here in this part of our study of AP. But there is definitely a religious reading of the Aeneid. Now, Virgil, of course, himself couldn't have seen it that way. We say that, of course, it's a religious text, but for different reasons, right? Paying honor and reverence to the gods is obviously Virgil's project. But Dante, reading back through history, will say, it's clear that everything Aeneas was doing was to prepare the world for St. Peter and, of course, the Catholic Church, right? Notice he continues, you say he came to that immortal world. In other words, he's speaking to Virgil. Virgil tells about how Aeneas went down into the underworld, and things he learned, again, it's all about learning, the propaedeutic word comes back, there led to the papal mantle in triumph for him. Later, the chosen vessel, Christ, too went and returned, carrying confirmation of that faith which opens the way with salvation at its end. Now, if you didn't spend any time in Sunday school, it may be hard to understand exactly what's happening here. In Christian theology, the idea is Jesus Christ is the Son of God, comes to earth, he dies, he's crucified, and during the time before his resurrection, that Jesus Christ goes down into hell to redeem lost souls, okay, before the resurrection. That's what he's talking about. In other words, notice the interesting little kind of dance that Dante the poet is doing for Dante the Pilgrim. In other words, some really famous people have gone into the underworld. He's already referencing, notice, Aeneas and Christ, which is always going to lead to the question, why me, right? Which will be the whole point of this canto, right? But I, here it comes, right? I'm at line 27 or so. But I, what cause, whose favor could send me forth on such a voyage? In other words, he says, I am no Aeneas or Paul, or we could think of Theseus or Orpheus or Hercules or Ulysses or any of the other heroes that have gone into the underworld. He says, I am no Aeneas or Paul. Now I want to go back to our comments that I made in Aeneid 11, line 378. You'll remember that there, Latinus, the king of the city, right, will say, we have fought the good fight. And it was at that point that I made the observation that it's pretty clear probably that Luke, the writer of the book of Acts in the New Testament, was acutely familiar, as was probably Paul as a Roman citizen, of the poem of the Aeneid. And the question has always been by biblical scholars, to what degree is Paul another Aeneas? And notice here, Dante will join the two together, Aeneas or Paul. He says, I'm not either of them. Not I, nor others think me of such worth. Ouch, this is the political Dante saying about the Florentines. They don't think that I'm worthy of a trip through hell and then to purgatory into heaven. And therefore, I have my fears of playing the fool to embark on such a venture. Now, notice the genius of this poem. Dante the poet will have Dante the Pilgrim say, I'm a little bit worried about looking like a fool going through this trip. Of course, really, we got Dante the poet making his observation, I'm a little bit worried about writing a poem like this to try to rival Virgil and, of course, Homer. In other words, I'm a little leery right now. Taking us back to the invocation of the muse already, I hope I can do the right thing here by doing this. You know, he says to Virgil, you are wise, you know my meaning better than I can tell. In other words, you can read my mind almost, like he's saying. And then, like one who, notice our simile, like one who unchooses his choice, and thinking again undoes what he started, so I became. A nullifying unease overcame my soul at that dark slope and voided the undertaking I had so quickly embraced. In other words, we have this saying in physical training and in religious training, count the cost. Dante will have said to Virgil in the first guy, yeah, sure, let's do this trip. And then he starts looking at where he's about to head down into hell, and he's like, I'm thinking I might unchoose my choice here because of why? Fear, right? Fear. In other words, by the way, notice the word choice gets used. Dante has the choice to either go or not to go. He says, maybe I answered too quickly. Notice now Virgil's time to talk. If I understand, the generous shade retorted, cowardice grips your spirit, which can twist a man away from the noblest enterprise, as a trick of vision startles a shying beast. Now, of course, this notion of cowardice will resurrect for us the idea of the four cardinal virtues, of course, of our study in Plato's Republic, of wisdom and courage. Notice here it's cowardice, the lack of courage, temperance, discipline. We're going to get to incontinence at the beginning of Inferno, and of course justice itself. We're going to get to that in the opening lines of Canto 3. So notice here, Virgil is saying to Dante the Pilgrim, I'm a little worried about this cowardice thing of yours because it can mess with you. Notice it can become like a trick of vision. It can keep you off the track. The word sin itself, many students are stunned by this, but the word sin itself etymologically actually just simply means to miss the target or the mark. In other words, you kind of shy away in some way. The idea is that the Platonic idea that you're going down the road and then all of a sudden one of those two horses pulls to either side. Same idea going on here. He says, then to continue at line 40, to ease your burden of fear, I will disclose why I came here and what I heard that compelled me first to feel compassion for you. It was a lady's voice, we're obviously talking now Beatrice, that called me where I dwelled in limbo. Notice this is the first mention of limbo. We're going to get to limbo later. That area right before hell where the unbaptized good pagans will live. A lady, he continues now about Beatrice, a lady so blessed and fairly featured, I prayed her to command me. In other words, she was beautiful. Everything that Dante ever said about Beatrice in any of his poems was that Beatrice was stunningly beautiful in not just physical ways, but of course in spiritual ways. Her eyes outjewel the stars in splendor. Oh, generous Mantuan spirit, she began in a soft voice of angelic sound, whose fames live still, and the world will still inherit as long as the world itself shall live. The idea is that for as long as the world lives, people will know Virgil and, of course, know his great poem, Aeneid. It's somewhat tragic that, of course, this is probably not the case anymore. Although we said in our study of the Aeneid, we know the Aeneid, we just don't know that it is the Aeneid, right? Every time you sit down to play a violent video game, you're playing along with the Aeneid, right? In many parts of the Aeneid, you just don't know it, right? She says, my friend, no friend of fortune has found his way, impeded on the barren slope, and fear has turned him round. In other words, Beatrice calls Dante the Pilgrim her friend. Notice she calls him no friend of fortune, which is exactly what Virgil calls Aeneas over and over again, luckless, right? He doesn't have good luck. Has found his way impeded on the barren slope. You'll remember the three animals of the previous. And fear has turned him round. I fear, notice how Dante plays games with the word fear. I fear he may be already lost, unaided, so far astray. I've come from heaven too late. So notice, Beatrice says, I have fear that maybe this is something that's not going to work out, and we're going to lose Dante. Go now with your fair speech and what is needed to save him. So notice we've got this motif where one person is going to save another person. We think, of course, of Nausicaa, don't we, in the Odyssey, who had to save Odysseus once he ends up on the island of the Phaeacians. We have that motif over and over again. I'm lost, I need somebody's help. Somebody else sends somebody to come and save me. It's kind of a tripartite view, if you will, right? Offer the help you have to give before he is lost, and I will be consoled. I am Beatrice. By the way, this is one of the only times that Beatrice is specifically noted in Inferno. Why? Well, it's hell. And she's too important and holy, sacred, to be mentioned in hell. She will be mentioned, obviously, in Purgatory and especially in Paradiso. Come from where I crave to be again. Who ask thus? I'm Beatrice. I want to get back to where I came, back to heaven, but I came to ask you. And then, interestingly, as love has willed, so have I spoken. Love here, of course, could be God. Love could be compassion. And when I return before my Lord, he will hear your praises told. Then she was silent, Virgil continuing. And I in turn began, O Lady of goodness, through whom alone mankind exceeds what the sky's least circle can contain within its compass. So sweet is your command, had I already obeyed, it would feel too late. In other words, I'm ready to obey you right away. Let's put this in our notes. This notion that right away, Virgil is showing us what obedience looks like. So that Dante can Dante the Pilgrim can pay attention. This is what obedience looks like. Later he'll call him his master. Whatever you tell me to do, that's what I will do. Had I already obeyed, it'd feel too late. But tell me how you so fearlessly descend to such a center. From that encompassing state you long to see again. Notice Dante the Pilgrim asking Virgil the poet, why are you here? How did you get here? And Virgil the poet telling a story about how he talked with Beatrice, and his question to Beatrice was, how did you get here? Notice the onion-like, or for the Shrek fans in the house, the parfait-like way in which this story will unfold. Okay, so we'll continue. She says, you yearn for the answer deeply. And I think this is important. That is to say, Dante is setting up all of the major softballs he's going to hit out of the park here later in the poem. The idea that the only way you're ever going to learn anything is to yearn. You got to have a level of curiosity. Notice in our poem, put this in your notes, this is huge. Notice in our poem how many times Dante will ask Virgil, hey, what is that? Hey, what is that? Hey, what is that? That's what good students do. Go back to our study of Glaucon. Brave in all things, we're told, in Plato's Republic, right? The idea that to be a good student means you ask good questions. You always want to learn. So in other words, she compliments him for asking the question, right? She says, so I'll tell you in short how I come to limbo, yet feel no terror. Fear. Notice the repetition of the word fear throughout this canto. Fear befits things with power for injury, not things that lack such power. In other words, you're only afraid of the things that can hurt you. If you're not afraid, then that means you know nothing can hurt you. We will come back to this at the end of the Divine Comedy when we meet that notion, that biblical idea that perfect love gets rid of all fear. There is no fear in love, right? She continues, God the Creator has by His mercy made me such that I cannot feel what you suffer. None of this fire assails me. This is an interesting line because it kind of reminds us of what the gods, of course, in all three of our poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, clearly understand as well. At moments, they do not feel human pain, human suffering. In heaven, we're told, she continues, a lady feels such pity for this impediment where I send you. Severe judgment is broken by her grace on high. To Lucy, she said. So in other words, now we got Mary talking to Lucy, talking to Beatrice, right? So notice this amazing scaffolding technique. This is the same scaffolding technique, obviously, that we saw when we studied our Chaucer too as well, right? She said to Lucy, she said, your faithful follower needs you. I commend you to him. I commend him to you. Lucy, the foe of every cruelty. There's interesting, scholars have sometimes said there's interesting stuff about Lucy and lucid and the idea of sight and the idea of light, and that apparently Dante possibly was losing his sight and had some help from the possibility of prayers to Lucy. There's some talk. You can do your own research there. Lucy, the foe of every cruelty, found me where I sat with Rachel. Now, of course, you know about this Rachel. This is from your biblical study of Genesis 29:16.